When Melania Trump decided to school Jasmine Crockett about proper conduct, the First Lady had no idea she was about to witness a masterpiece in dismantling condescension without losing an ounce of dignity. The delicate percussion of crystal glasses and hushed conversations filled the air, but every eye gravitated toward the head table like iron filings to a magnet. The Mayflower Hotel's Grand Ballroom in Washington, D.C. was packed beyond capacity with lawmakers, aides, journalists, and power brokers, each seat occupied by someone whose influence extended far beyond these ornate walls. At the epicenter, framed by pristine white florals and the harsh glare of media lights, sat First Lady Melania Trump. The luncheon had been marketed as a bipartisan olive branch, a rare opportunity to demonstrate that civility could survive even Washington's toxic atmosphere. But seasoned political observers know that beneath the practiced smiles and choreographed pleasantries, tension often lurks in plain sight. Today, it wasn't just lurking, it was coiled like a spring waiting. Representative Jasmine Crockett had arrived moments before the First Lady, wearing a striking emerald suit that cut through the room's beige neutrality like a declaration. Crockett wasn't the type to blend into wallpaper. She carried herself with an energy that suggested she'd rather confront uncomfortable truths than pretend they didn't exist. Several tables away, reporters were already trading knowing looks and whispered predictions. They'd witnessed Crockett in committee hearings, razor-sharp, lightning-quick, utterly fearless when facing opposition. Melania, draped in an impeccably tailored cream dress with understated diamonds, sat with perfect posture, hands arranged precisely on the linen tablecloth. She didn't need to project authority. Her mere presence commanded it. Since reclaiming her role as First Lady, she had mastered the art of calculated public appearances, where every word, though sparse, carried substantial weight. But tonight's gathering had captured political insiders' attention for one compelling reason. Both women occupied the same spotlight, under the same scrutinizing gaze, and that combination promised fireworks. The kind of viral moment that would dominate every news cycle and social media feed for weeks. The ballroom atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Conversations remained deliberately muted, as if everyone instinctively knew they were witnessing something significant and didn't want to miss a single exchange. Jasmine lifted her water glass, glancing briefly toward Melania's table with an unreadable expression. Melania returned the look with equal composure, the faintest hint of a smile playing at her lips. Neither woman spoke. Not yet. The silence between them felt charged with possibility. When the moderator introduced the First Lady, polite applause rippled through the crowd as she approached the podium. Her voice was measured, deliberate as she spoke about unity's importance, the necessity of respectful discourse, and public figures' responsibility to model exemplary behavior. The speech hit all the expected notes. Diplomatic, safe, wrapped in political niceties. Yet there was an unmistakable edge when she referenced recent displays of incivility that have diminished our institution's dignity. She didn't name names, but the timing of her glance toward Crockett was impossible to ignore. Crockett's gaze never wavered. She didn't fidget or force a smile. She simply watched, absorbing every syllable like evidence being filed away for future reference. Several attendees noticed the wordless exchange, leaning toward each other with raised eyebrows. At the press table, hands moved instinctively toward phone cameras. When Melania concluded, the applause felt thinner than before, more obligatory than enthusiastic. The moderator expressed gratitude and announced a brief Q&A session would follow. Jasmine's name was called almost immediately. She rose deliberately, not from hesitation, but because she understood the gravity of the moment. In a room where power functions as currency, she wasn't about to spend hers carelessly. The microphone was passed to her. She didn't rush to speak. Instead, she looked directly at the First Lady, then swept her gaze across the audience, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to pull everyone forward in their seats. When she began, Her tone was controlled, but unmistakably firm. She acknowledged civility's importance, then pivoted skillfully, addressing the reality that civility without accountability was merely performance art. She spoke not just as a congresswoman, but as someone who had spent years fighting to be heard in rooms exactly like this one. She wove together examples from congressional hearings, moments when her voice had been cut off, her points dismissed not for their merit, but because some found her delivery too forceful. "Respect," she said, her voice cutting through the room's tension, "isn't about staying silent to preserve others' comfort. It's about speaking truth, even when that truth is inconvenient." All heads turned toward Melania. Camera shutters clicked faster. The room's energy shifted subtly, like an ocean tide beginning to turn. But the real transformation was still coming. Because in politics, timing is everything, and Jasmine Crockett knew precisely when to press her advantage. The luncheon had been orchestrated by the Congressional Women's Caucus, a group renowned for occasionally achieving the impossible, getting polar opposite political figures to share the same table without complete chaos erupting. Invitations had circulated weeks in advance, and the guest list had become a talking point in political circles, not just for who would attend, but for the volatile mix of personalities, rivalries, and alliances that made this event feel potentially explosive. The Mayflower's crystal chandeliers bathed the room in warm amber light, but beneath that gentle illumination, every table carried unspoken hierarchies. Front and center sat the First Lady, flanked by senior senators and major donors. Closer to the periphery were junior Congress members, staffers, and political strategists, sharp minds with sharper ambitions. Jasmine Crockett was positioned strategically in the second row, close enough to be visible, distant enough to be underestimated. Melania's public persona had always blended grace with guardedness. She rarely spoke in political venues, but when she did, she made clear she wasn't afraid to tackle topics others might avoid. Her team knew today required delicate maneuvering, acknowledging unity's importance without ignoring the headline-grabbing confrontations that had defined recent committee hearings. It wasn't coincidental that her speech had emphasized decorum and professionalism in politics. What Melania hadn't anticipated was the quiet readiness in Jasmine's demeanor. Crockett had weathered her share of political battles, some televised, others behind closed doors, and had learned that in politics, restraint could be as powerful as confrontation. In the moments following Melania's pointed remark, she hadn't reacted visibly, but she was already crafting her response mentally. Servers moved between tables, refilling coffee and delivering plates of herb-crusted chicken, wild rice, and seasonal vegetables. Conversations remained subdued, with eyes darting between the First Lady and the Congresswoman who had yet to respond. At the press table, a Philadelphia Inquirer correspondent quietly mouthed to her photographer, "Get ready." 2 tables away, a Republican senator from Arizona leaned toward his Democratic colleague from Oregon. "She's going to respond," he murmured, glancing at Crockett. His colleague nodded without taking her eyes off the Congresswoman. Jasmine's mind was crystalline, her thoughts sharpening with each passing second. She understood how easily these moments could spiral, how a single misstep could dominate headlines for weeks. But she also knew something else. Handled correctly, this could become the kind of exchange that would define her legacy for years to come. The moderator, sensing the tension, kept the Q&A moving briskly. A question to a senator about trade policy, another to a business leader about workforce development. But the room's attention kept gravitating back to the 2 women who hadn't yet directly engaged. When Jasmine's name was finally called, a quiet wave of anticipation swept through the crowd. She rose with deliberate control, adjusting her jacket before accepting the microphone. Cameras found her instantly. She began with a courteous acknowledgement of the First Lady's remarks, even thanking her for emphasizing unity. Then she pivoted, subtly at first, then more directly. "Unity," she said, isn't built by avoiding difficult truths. It's forged by confronting them head-on, even when they're uncomfortable. Melania's expression remained unchanged, but her gaze locked onto Jasmine's with laser focus. The First Lady was no stranger to public challenges. She'd faced criticism before, but there was something in the Congresswoman's tone, measured yet surgical, that signaled this wouldn't be a simple exchange of polite disagreements. Jasmine spoke about her experiences in the House, recounting moments when she'd been interrupted mid-sentence, accused of excessive aggression, or told her passion was inappropriate. She didn't name names, but her examples were vivid enough for those in the room to recognize the incidents. She connected these experiences to a broader issue: how women in politics, particularly those who refuse to dilute their convictions, are often judged by different standards. Her words weren't accusations directed at the First Lady, but they didn't need to be. The implication was crystal clear. Civility cannot be selectively applied, and professionalism cannot become a shield to avoid confronting injustice. Some guests leaned forward in their seats. Others glanced at Melania to gauge her response. The First Lady maintained perfect composure, hands still folded on the table, but phones in the press section were already buzzing with texts to editors. We might have our headline. And yet, this was only the beginning. Crockett hadn't even reached the part that would make the entire ballroom hold its breath. But before she went there, she knew she had to draw every person in that room completely into her orbit. Jasmine Crockett had spent enough time in politics to understand how rooms like the Mayflower's ballroom functioned. This wasn't just a venue. It was a stage where every glance, every pause, every subtle vocal inflection could be magnified and replayed across the nation within hours. Her presence here, within speaking distance of the First Lady, was no accident. Her team had accepted the invitation, knowing it might place her in exactly this kind of high-stakes situation, one that could either cement her reputation or provide her critics with ammunition. She stood with the microphone in her hand, her emerald suit catching the light with every movement. While her outward expression remained steady, her mind was calculating rapidly. This wouldn't be one of those empty, polite exchanges where both sides left without saying anything meaningful. If she was going to speak, she was going to make every word count. The people in this room weren't strangers to her. Some had been allies, others adversaries, and a few had played both roles at different points in her career. She'd clashed with colleagues over policy, fought fiercely in hearings, and emerged from each confrontation with a clearer understanding of her place in the political arena. She had been underestimated more times than she could count, and she had learned to let people maintain that misconception until the moment came to prove them wrong. From her position, Jasmine could see Melania perfectly. The cream dress, the diamond studs, the flawless composure. There was no sign of irritation, no raised eyebrow, no impatient gesture. It was the kind of poker face that came from years of operating under relentless public scrutiny. But Jasmine understood that someone's lack of visible reaction didn't mean they weren't feeling the pressure. Her opening words to the audience were measured, almost conversational. First Lady Trump, I appreciate your comments on decorum and professionalism. I think we can all agree that public service demands both. But there's a critical difference between maintaining decorum and silencing necessary voices. The room's atmosphere shifted. Not loudly, but in the way people straightened in their chairs or paused mid-bite to listen more intently. Jasmine didn't rush. She allowed her sentences to breathe, letting each point land before moving to the next. I've sat in hearings where my colleagues have raised their voices, interrupted others, even made remarks that were personal rather than policy-focused. Sometimes those moments came from men who were passionate about an issue, sometimes from women who were equally passionate. But I've noticed something interesting. When a man raises his voice in frustration, it's called leadership. When a woman does it, it's called a problem. That line hit the room like a controlled explosion. Several people murmured in agreement. Others glanced at the First Lady, searching for the slightest flicker of response. Melania maintained her stillness, but her eyes remained fixed on Jasmine, not in defiance, but with something closer to assessment, as though she was weighing whether this would remain an intellectual exchange or evolve into something more combative. Jasmine continued, her voice unwavering. Civility isn't about staying quiet so no one feels uncomfortable. It's about addressing truth in a way that moves us forward. If that truth challenges someone's comfort level, perhaps that's a sign the conversation is overdue. The press table was electric with activity now. Journalists typed frantically, trying to capture every direct quote. The photographer from earlier leaned toward her colleague and whispered, "She's not holding back." From across the room, a congressman who had once criticized Jasmine for being too confrontational watched with a mixture of discomfort and fascination. He wasn't accustomed to seeing her in a setting where the tension was so public yet so controlled. Jasmine took a brief pause, scanning the room. She wasn't just addressing Melania anymore. She was speaking to everyone who had ever been told to temper their passion for the sake of appearances. "Professionalism matters," she said, "but so does honesty, and we must be careful not to confuse one for the other." That final sentence landed with devastating precision. The audience was no longer passively listening. They were locked in, waiting to see where she would take them next. The subtle power dynamic in the room was shifting, not explosively, but in small, deliberate increments. Crockett understood this was the point where some speakers would retreat, choosing to smooth things over before the tension reached its peak. But Jasmine had no intention of making this a polite, forgettable exchange. She was only getting started. The Q&A was designed to feel casual. That was the concept. No formal podiums, no scripted exchanges, just handheld microphones and open dialogue between guests and the First Lady. But casual in Washington rarely maintains that character for long, especially when stakes are high and cameras are recording every moment. Jasmine's words had already captivated the room, but now it was Melania's turn to respond. The moderator glanced at her, offering the microphone with a subtle, almost hesitant gesture. Melania accepted it without the slightest trace of reluctance, her posture unchanged. "Congresswoman," Melania began, her accent softening each syllable, "I think we can agree that women face unique challenges in public life. I am not here to silence voices, but we must also remember that how we speak can determine whether our message is heard. Sometimes tone can mean the difference between progress and deeper division." It was tactful, polished, the kind of response that seemed harmless on the surface. But the experienced political ears in the room caught the underlying suggestion that Jasmine's approach might be counterproductive. Several attendees exchanged glances. This wasn't outright confrontation, but it was a carefully placed line in the sand. Jasmine didn't break eye contact. She held the microphone in her lap for a moment, as if considering whether to respond immediately or let the moment breathe. The pause wasn't awkward. It was strategic. "First Lady Trump," she said, "I understand your point about tone, but in my experience, people don't always object to the tone itself. They object to what's being said. When certain truths make people uncomfortable, it becomes easier to critique the delivery than address the content." The words were calm, but the message landed with surgical precision. A journalist from the Dallas Morning News immediately jotted down the quote. Melania offered a small, diplomatic smile. "I think we have both witnessed examples where strong words have closed doors instead of opening them," she replied. Jasmine leaned slightly forward. "And I've witnessed situations where strong words were the only thing that got the door open in the first place." That was the first real spark. The room felt it. Nobody moved to interrupt, and the moderator wisely chose not to intervene. These weren't raised voices or sharp insults, but there was a firmness, a tightening of the verbal tension between them. At a nearby table, Senator Lillian Hargrave, known for her blunt assessments, whispered to her aide, "This is going to dominate headlines." The First Lady's expression remained composed, but her next words carried a more pointed edge. "We must set examples for the next generation. They observe how we conduct ourselves, how we treat others, even in disagreement." It was a safe remark superficially, but paired with the subtle emphasis on conduct, it was unmistakably a return to the earlier theme of decorum. Jasmine wasn't about to let that pass unchallenged. She leaned slightly toward the microphone, her voice steady but warmer now, almost conversational. "I agree. Our conduct matters tremendously. But I also believe the next generation is watching to see if we're willing to speak up when something is wrong. If they see us stay silent just to keep things pleasant, what example does that set?" Several heads nodded this time. Not the hesitant, cautious movements of people testing the waters, but firm gestures from those who clearly agreed. The room's energy was no longer balanced. What had begun as a polite exchange was becoming something more complex, still civil, but charged with undercurrents. The political observers could feel it shifting toward a moment that might define the entire luncheon. Melania's team at the head table exchanged quick, quiet glances. They had prepared her for challenging questions, but they hadn't necessarily anticipated this level of public pushback from a member of Congress during a formal luncheon. From the other side of the room, a cluster of younger staffers huddled near the back doors, one of them muttering, "This is going to be all over Twitter by tonight." The moderator finally stepped in, not to end the exchange, but to guide it. "Thank you both. This is exactly the kind of conversation the caucus hoped for today. One where perspectives can be shared openly." But everyone in the room understood the conversation wasn't really finished. Not yet. Both women had held their ground without breaking civility, but each remark had carried a sharper edge than the last. If anyone thought Jasmine Crockett had made her strongest point already, they were about to learn she'd only been setting the stage. The moderator shifted attention to another question, this time directed at a senator from Vermont about bipartisan infrastructure projects. It was an intentional pivot, an attempt to ease the tension without abruptly cutting off the exchange between Melania and Jasmine. But the room's focus hadn't fully shifted. Even as the senator discussed funding allocations and project timelines, eyes kept gravitating back to the two women. Jasmine remained seated, microphone resting on the table, her gaze steady but not fixed on anyone in particular. On the surface, she appeared relaxed, sipping water, occasionally glancing toward the stage, but anyone who knew her could tell she was calculating her next move. Timing was crucial. Too soon, and it would seem like a rebuttal. Too late, and the impact would diminish. She let the senator's answer run its course, followed by polite applause, then watched as the moderator scanned the room for the next raised hand. A congressman from Nevada was recognized, asking a softball question about public-private partnerships. Jasmine barely moved, but her mind was working in overdrive, replaying the First Lady's earlier remarks about tone and conduct. Melania, for her part, hadn't retreated. She sat with quiet poise, her expression unreadable, but not dismissive. She understood that in politics, perception often mattered more than content. Looking defensive or rattled could shift the narrative faster than any headline could be written. She wasn't going to give that away. The audience, however, was caught between listening to the ongoing Q&A and waiting for Jasmine to speak again. The tension wasn't loud. It was the kind you felt in stillness, in the way a room holds its breath without realizing it. At the press table, a political columnist whispered to her photographer, "If she responds again, this is going viral." "There's no way it doesn't." Finally, the moderator glanced toward Jasmine again, offering the microphone almost as if testing the waters. Jasmine took it, not with a quick grab, but with a calm, deliberate movement that made clear she wasn't rushing. She began with a nod toward the previous speakers, acknowledging their points before pivoting back to her exchange with Melania. I want to add something, she said, her tone steady but charged with quiet conviction. We talk extensively about tone, and I respect the importance of how we communicate. But I've found that in this work, the urgency of an issue can sometimes demand a tone that's sharper than what makes people comfortable. Several heads turned toward Melania. Jasmine didn't glance at her yet. She kept her eyes on the broader audience, widening the scope of her message. Think about the moments in history when real change happened, she continued. It wasn't because someone whispered. It wasn't because they waited until everyone was ready to hear it. It was because someone spoke with a conviction that cut through the noise, even if it made people uncomfortable. The line resonated. Several people broke into quiet applause before catching themselves, unsure if it was appropriate mid-discussion. Jasmine allowed a small pause, not to savor the reaction, but to let her words sink in. Then she finally turned toward Melania. First Lady Trump, I understand your point about setting an example. I'd like to think we can set one that shows strength and honesty can coexist with respect. I'm not interested in teaching the next generation that politeness matters more than truth. The First Lady's face remained neutral, but several observers swore they saw the slightest shift in her posture, as if she was considering how to respond. Melania's team at the head table maintained their formation, attentive, calm, ready to pivot if necessary. But this wasn't a debate stage. The rules here were unwritten, and both women understood that winning the moment wasn't about scoring points. It was about leaving a lasting impression. The moderator glanced at the time, clearly aware that this luncheon was no longer just a ceremonial gathering. It had transformed into a live political moment, the kind that would be clipped into 30-second sound bites and replayed endlessly. Jasmine handed the microphone back with a quiet, "Thank you," then leaned back slightly in her chair. She wasn't retreating. She was giving the moment space to breathe, understanding that sometimes silence could be as powerful as the sharpest line. But the real shift wouldn't come from the pause. It would come when Jasmine decided to push forward with everything she'd been holding back. The lunch plates were being cleared, but no one was paying attention to the clinking dishes anymore. Even the servers seemed to move more slowly, glancing toward the stage as though sensing that something significant was about to unfold. The moderator had just concluded another audience question when she looked toward Jasmine, clearly offering her the space to speak again. Jasmine didn't hesitate this time. She accepted the microphone with a simple nod of thanks and leaned forward slightly, her hands resting lightly on the table in front of her. There was no rush in her voice, no sign she felt pressured to match the First Lady's poise. Instead, she spoke as though addressing a small circle of people she'd known for years, measured, direct, but with a current of steel beneath every word. I've heard it said many times that if you want people to listen, you have to say it softly, she began. But in my experience, some truths are ignored no matter how softly you say them. The problem isn't always the tone. It's that the message makes people uncomfortable. A low murmur ran through the room. Some attendees leaned forward, elbows on tables, eyes fixed on her. Others glanced between Jasmine and Melania, waiting for a visible reaction. I think about the hearings I've participated in, Jasmine continued. When I've raised a point that challenges the status quo, I've been told I'm too aggressive. But I've watched others, often men, use sharper words and louder voices, and they're called passionate leaders. If the exact same tone gets labeled differently depending on who's speaking, that tells us something important about the system we're operating in. From the corner of the room, an aide to a senior senator whispered, "She's not pulling any punches." Jasmine shifted slightly, now looking directly at Melania. Her tone didn't change, but the weight behind her words grew heavier. "You said we should set an example for the next generation. I absolutely agree. But that example has to be about telling the truth, even when it's messy, even when it's not wrapped in perfectly polished words." Melania listened without interrupting, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She maintained the same steady composure, but the room could sense the intensity in the quiet way she held Jasmine's gaze. Jasmine pressed on. We cannot teach young people that being polite matters more than being honest. If they see us sugarcoating reality so no one feels challenged, they'll learn to do the same. And we'll end up with leaders who know how to smile for cameras, but not how to confront problems. The press table was alive with movement now. Phones recording, reporters typing frantically to capture every line. This wasn't just a rebuttal. It was the kind of moment that could define both women's appearances at this luncheon for years. Melania finally responded, her voice even. Congresswoman, I agree that honesty is important, but we can be truthful without tearing others down. I believe we can have strength without hostility. Jasmine didn't miss a beat. And I believe that sometimes what's called hostility is just truth spoken by someone who refuses to make it easier to hear. The discomfort isn't always about the delivery. It's about the reality being addressed. There was no shouting, no sarcasm. Just two women standing firmly in their respective positions, their words deliberate and layered. The room was silent except for the soft clicking of camera shutters. One guest, a business leader from Ohio, later described it as watching two people play chess in real time. Each move precise, each response strategic. Jasmine shifted her focus back to the audience. Here's what I want the next generation to take from moments like this. Speak your truth with clarity, listen with the intent to understand, and never let the fear of making someone uncomfortable keep you from saying what needs to be said. That final line landed with devastating impact. People weren't just listening, they were absorbing it, and you could see it in their faces. The moderator, sensing they were at the end of a moment that would be replayed and analyzed, smoothly thanked both women and opened the floor to another question. But even as a policy discussion about healthcare began, the weight of the exchange hung in the air like electricity after storm. The real turning point was still ahead, when the room itself, not just the two women, would start leaning decisively toward Jasmine. By now, the luncheon had lost the predictable rhythm these events usually followed. Conversations at each table were quieter, more fragmented, as people tried to keep one ear on the ongoing questions and another on the possibility that Jasmine might speak again. The servers had abandoned any sense of ceremony, setting down dessert plates, small slices of lemon tart. Without announcing them, their eyes flicking toward the head tables. Melania's last response had been measured, but it hadn't shifted the energy away from Jasmine. In fact, it seemed to have given the Congresswoman an opening, and Jasmine knew exactly how to use an opening. The next audience question was directed at a policy expert from the Department of Education, but even as the official spoke, Jasmine caught the moderator's eye. It was a subtle gesture, just enough to signal that she had more to add. The moderator, sensing the moment, nodded almost imperceptibly. When the microphone came her way again, Jasmine didn't stand this time. She remained seated, leaning forward just enough to project her voice into the room without straining. The choice to stay seated made her words feel less like a speech and more like a conversation that everyone had been invited into. I want to build on what we've been discussing, she began, her voice steady. Because this isn't just about one luncheon or two people on opposite sides of a discussion. It's about something bigger. The way we decide whose voices matter and how they're allowed to be heard. She glanced briefly at Melania, not in challenge, but in acknowledgement, before turning back to the audience. In committee rooms, in press conferences, even here today, there's a balance people expect you to strike. You can be strong, but not too strong. You can be direct, but not so direct that it ruffles feathers. And if you happen to be a woman, the limits are even narrower. The remark wasn't accusatory, but it was grounded in lived experience. Several attendees nodded, some with slow, deliberate agreement, others with a quick, almost instinctive response of people who'd witnessed exactly what she was talking about. Jasmine continued. I've been told more than once that if I adjusted my tone, people might be more receptive. But here's the problem. If I adjust my tone to make my point more palatable to those who are already comfortable, who am I really serving? The people who need me to fight for them, or the people who just want to feel better about hearing it? That line drew a quiet ripple through the crowd. It wasn't applause, at least not yet, but it was the unmistakable sound of people processing a point they couldn't easily dismiss. Melania listened, her hands still folded, her face as composed as ever. She didn't interrupt, and Jasmine took that as an unspoken signal to finish her thought. "I want us to imagine something," Jasmine said, shifting her tone to something warmer, almost reflective. "Imagine a young girl in St. Louis or Albuquerque or Des Moines, watching a moment like this. She hears someone in power say that tone matters more than substance. Then she hears someone else say the truth matters, even if it makes people uncomfortable. Which lesson do we want her to walk away with? Because I know which one I want her to remember." This time, a smattering of applause broke out. It was hesitant at first, people checking to see if it was appropriate, but it grew just enough to make the moment clear. The room was leaning toward Jasmine. Melania, to her credit, didn't bristle. She offered a small, almost approving smile before looking toward the moderator, a signal that she wasn't going to engage in a back and forth that might shift the attention even further. The moderator moved on, but the audience didn't fully let go of what had just happened. At the press table, a correspondent from the Boston Globe muttered, "She just owned the room without raising her voice." Even the people who might have disagreed with Jasmine's politics couldn't deny the effectiveness of her delivery. She had taken the initial challenge, transformed it into a broader statement about systemic double standards, and managed to make it resonate beyond herself. And that was the point. This wasn't just about defending her own reputation. Jasmine was framing the exchange in a way that made it about something bigger than her, bigger than Melania, bigger than the luncheon. But the full impact of her words would only become clear when the tide of the room's energy made its final, undeniable shift. The atmosphere in the Mayflower's ballroom had fundamentally changed. What began as a neatly scripted luncheon now felt like a live moment that no one had planned for, but everyone was invested in. Even those pretending to focus on their desserts were stealing glances at the head tables, waiting for the next development. The moderator moved to recognize a question from a small business owner at the back of the room. It was a safe inquiry about workforce development, the kind of topic that usually draws polite nods but little excitement. Still, as the conversation played out, the audience's attention kept drifting back toward Jasmine. Melania seemed to sense it too. She had remained composed, but there was a subtle awareness in her posture now. Her shoulders just slightly elevated, her hands clasped a touch tighter than before. She understood the room's mood had shifted. The balance of attention wasn't evenly shared anymore. When the moderator announced there was time for just one more exchange, the room seemed to straighten as one. Without even being called on, Jasmine raised her hand slightly. The moderator didn't hesitate. "Congresswoman Crockett, you have the floor." Jasmine took the microphone and looked around the room, taking in not just the front tables, but the people seated along the walls, the aides leaning against the back. Even the servers paused near the kitchen doors. Everyone was listening now. "I've been thinking about what's been said today," she began, her tone conversational but anchored with intent. "About tone, about civility, about how we present ourselves when the stakes are high. And I want to make something clear. Civility is important, but it's not the same thing as silence." She let that hang for a moment. Too often, civility gets used like a measuring stick for whether someone deserves to be heard at all. If you meet a certain standard of calm, you're considered credible. If you don't, suddenly your ideas are dismissed before they've even been considered. And here's the problem with that approach. Those standards are not applied equally to everyone. A low hum of agreement passed through parts of the room. Jasmine's gaze swept back to Melania, but her words were for everyone. When we talk about setting an example for the next generation, I think about the young people I've met in my district. The ones who've told me they feel invisible until they speak in a way that can't be ignored. They've been told to be polite, to wait their turn, to find a better way to express themselves. But sometimes their turn never comes unless they take it. She leaned back slightly, her voice still calm but her words gaining weight. I refuse to teach them that politeness is the price of being heard. I want them to know that their voices have value, whether they come out measured or come out fierce. For the first time, the applause wasn't hesitant. It broke through quickly, a wave that spread from the middle tables outward. People who'd stayed quiet earlier were now joining in, some even nodding toward her as if to say, "You've got it right." Melania sat through it without flinching, offering the same diplomatic smile she had worn earlier. But the difference was clear. This was no longer her room. The energy, the momentum, the focus had shifted entirely to Jasmine. When the clapping died down, Jasmine added, "And that's the example I want the next generation to see, that you can speak with courage even when the room isn't built for you." It wasn't loud or theatrical, but it was final in its own way. She passed the microphone back to the moderator, her part complete. The moderator thanked both women, trying to bring the event to a close on a diplomatic note. But as people began to stand, shake hands, and gather their belongings, it was clear who they were talking about. At the press table, one reporter muttered, "This is going to run above the fold tomorrow." As the First Lady's staff began ushering her toward the exit, Jasmine remained at her table, greeting attendees who came up to shake her hand, exchange a word, or thank her for saying what they'd been thinking. The moment belonged to her now. But what happened after the luncheon would prove that this exchange was just the spark for something much larger. The luncheon officially ended with a moderator's carefully rehearsed closing remarks, but no one in the Mayflower's ballroom was thinking about the catering or the decorative centerpieces anymore. Conversations were animated, heads bent close together, and cell phones were out in every direction. Some discreet, some openly recording as attendees gave their immediate reactions to the exchange they'd just witnessed. Jasmine remained in her seat for several minutes after the First Lady exited, shaking hands with members of Congress, policy advocates, and even a few journalists who wandered over under the guise of just saying hello. The emerald suit she'd chosen seemed even more deliberate now, bold enough to stand out in photographs, yet professional enough to avoid accusations of theatrics. A reporter from the Sacramento Bee leaned in and asked quietly, "Congresswoman, did you anticipate that moment?" Jasmine smiled faintly. "I anticipated speaking my mind," she replied. "What comes from that is up to the people listening." Across the room, a small group of political aides huddled near the coat check, discussing how the interaction would play on social media. "Clips are already going up," one of them said, holding out her phone to show a short video posted less than 15 minutes earlier. It was Jasmine's line about politeness not being the price of being heard, and the retweets were climbing by the second. Melania's departure had been swift but controlled. Her Secret Service detail moved her through the side doors without hurry, but without lingering either. To the casual observer, it might have looked like a normal exit, yet to those in the know, it was a calculated decision. Leave before the press could swarm and before Jasmine's growing crowd could make the optics even more lopsided. Meanwhile, in the hallway outside the ballroom, a cameraman from a national news network was already setting up a portable light, waiting for Jasmine to emerge. His producer whispered, "She's the story now, not the luncheon." Inside, Jasmine finally rose from her seat, moving toward the exit at an unhurried pace, stopping every few steps as someone reached out to speak with her. There was a mix of faces, fellow lawmakers offering quiet congratulations, constituents thanking her for saying what needed to be said, and journalists angling for a quick quote. By the time she stepped into the hallway, the small press cluster had grown into a half circle, microphones extended toward her, Recorders held just inches from her face. A question cut through the noise. "Congresswoman, do you think the First Lady's comments were aimed directly at you?" Jasmine didn't blink. "You'd have to ask her that," she said evenly. "What I can tell you is that my comments were aimed at making sure the conversation about civility includes everyone, not just those who fit a narrow definition of how we should speak." The answer was soundbite gold, concise, firm, and resistant to being spun as a personal attack. The reporters knew it too. Several immediately turned toward their phones, typing frantically. In the lobby, a television over the hotel bar was already playing a breaking news segment. The cheerin' read, "Crockett challenges First Lady over civility remarks." The footage showed Jasmine's final lines from the luncheon, the applause audible in the background. By the time she reached the curb to step into her car, her phone had lit up with messages from friends, colleagues, and complete strangers. Screenshots of trending hashtags. Hashtag Jasmine Crockett, hashtag Crockett Clipback, hashtag Tone and Truth filled her notifications. One text from a fellow representative simply read, "You own that room." Meanwhile, inside the West Wing, Melania's communications staff was already drafting a statement. It wouldn't directly reference Jasmine. Doing so would risk giving her more oxygen. But it would double down on the importance of unity and constructive dialogue. The aim was to keep the First Lady above the fray, while subtly reinforcing her original point. But out in the public sphere, the narrative was moving too quickly to control. Podcasts were queuing up their takes, opinion columnists were drafting headlines, and on political Twitter, users were debating whether Jasmine's comments were a much-needed truth or an unnecessary challenge to the First Lady. For Jasmine, it didn't matter which side people landed on. She knew the conversation had already expanded beyond her and Melania. It was now about the broader question of how women in politics are judged, and by what standards. And that was exactly where she wanted the focus to be. But the real legacy of the moment would depend on what happened next, and whether Jasmine could turn a viral exchange into lasting influence. The ride back to Jasmine's office was quiet, at least on the outside. Her communications director, Marcus Hale, sat beside her, scrolling through live updates, every few seconds giving a low whistle at the numbers climbing on social media. "We're already at 2 million views across the clips," he said finally, breaking the silence. "That's just Twitter and Instagram. By tonight, the cable networks are going to run this nonstop." Jasmine didn't look up from the window. "It's not about the views," she replied. "It's about the message. If people only remember it as a back and forth with the First Lady, then I didn't do my job." Marcus nodded, though he knew full well that the optics alone had already cemented it as a defining moment in politics. You didn't often get to control how a moment was framed, but you could shape what happened next. When they reached her office, the hallway outside was busier than usual. Staffers from other offices passed by, some offering a thumbs up, others stopping to shake her hand. Inside, Jasmine's legislative aide had already pulled together a draft press release, not about the clapback, but about the broader issue she'd raised. How public standards for tone and professionalism were unevenly applied. "I want that out before the evening news cycle," Jasmine said, scanning the draft quickly. "And make sure we emphasize that this is about how we build a better model for the next generation, not about personalities." She spent the next hour on calls, speaking with reporters, local leaders, and even a few young constituents who had reached out via email after seeing the clip. One high school senior from St. Louis told her, "I didn't think people in Congress talked like that, like they actually understood what it's like to be told to stay quiet." That call stayed with her. It was proof that the exchange had already reached beyond the Beltway, touching people who weren't in the room. People who might never set foot in the Capitol, but who still needed to see moments like this happen. By late afternoon, the television in her office played a muted news segment showing side-by-side clips. Melania at the podium, then Jasmine speaking from her seat. The panelists debated whether the Congresswoman had gone too far or whether she had simply spoken truth to power. Jasmine didn't care for either phrase. Both reduced the substance of her message to a headline. Marcus walked in with a fresh update. "We've got invitations for 3 Sunday shows, and the Washington Post editorial board wants an op-ed from you on civility." Jasmine considered it for a moment. "We'll do the op-ed, but I'm not going to sit on a panel where it turns into a sport. If I'm talking about it, I'm talking about the actual issue, not just replaying the clip." Later that evening, she finally allowed herself a moment alone in her office. The sun had dipped low enough to paint the Potomac in gold, and the city hummed with its usual mix of urgency and fatigue. She thought back to the look in Melania's eyes during the luncheon. Not hostile, not dismissive, but calculating. The First Lady had handled herself with composure, and Jasmine could respect that. In a different context, they might have even found common ground. But today had been about drawing a line, and she knew she had drawn it clearly. She picked up her phone and typed out a short post for her personal account. Politeness matters. Honesty matters more. Today wasn't about disagreement. It was about showing that respect and truth can stand together. It was concise, clear, and without a single unnecessary flourish. Within minutes, it was being shared by people across the political spectrum. The lesson from the day wasn't complicated, but it was powerful. In rooms where the rules are unspoken and the stakes are high, composure and conviction can coexist. You don't have to choose between being respectful and being truthful. You can be both, and you can do it in a way that makes people listen. For Jasmine, the goal had never been to overshadow the First Lady. It was to remind everyone watching, whether in the ballroom, at home, or scrolling through their phones, that the measure of a leader isn't just in how they speak when it's easy. It's in how they speak when the words are hard and the world is watching. She shut off the office lights, stepped into the hallway, and pulled the door closed behind her. The day had been long, but it had also been proof that standing firm didn't have to mean standing alone. Somewhere out there, she knew, a young woman had seen what happened and thought to herself, "I can do that too." And if even one person felt that way after today, then it had all been worth it. If you believe in respectful but honest conversations, ones that challenge power without losing composure, then share this story, subscribe for more, and let's keep the dialogue going. Your voice matters. Use it.